The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Hi, everybody. This is Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent with St. Louis Public Radio. Sarah Kendzior has become one of America's preeminent political voices over the past few years, often using biting and prescient writing to analyze threats to the country's democracy. She's often used her home in St. Louis and Missouri to illustrate vexing challenges of economic decline and political instability. And in her new book, They Knew How a Culture of Conspiracy Kept America Complacent, Kendzior explores how conspiracy is baked into the story of America. I talked with Kendzior earlier this week at a Left Bank Books event at the Ethical Society. I started off our chat by noting that our conversation was a long time coming. Sarah and I know this, but many of you don't know this. This conversation is well over 2 years in the making. We were planning on having a discussion just like this for her last book, Hiding in Plain Sight, in April 2020. But I guess Tiger King caused a mania and everything got canceled. Oh yeah, it was the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's kind of how
COVID eternal.
And that's kind of how I want to start this conversation. How did the pandemic affect how you wrote They Knew?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people during the never-ending COVID, I struggled creatively. I struggled getting started with They Knew. I hit that pandemic wall, and then once I started writing, I ended up writing about things that I hadn't planned. You know, I'd had an outline for the book that I intended to follow, and instead what poured out of me in that first chapter was a haunted hotel in northern Arkansas where a notorious con artist, and radio announcer and demagogue and flagrant personality had gone anti-vaxxer and tricked a lot of people into taking fake cures for a terrible disease. And
I love, here's why I love that part. I'm not, my family is not from that part of Arkansas, but my mother lived in Little Rock, Arkansas through her high school years. So I love any author that incorporates Arkansas into your work.
I like Arkansas. I mean, I love visiting Arkansas. The town I was writing about is Eureka Springs. You'll see this right off the bat. It's not a spoiler or anything. It's a nonfiction book, so but there are indeed spoilers since we're living in an era of selective amnesia. But basically at that point, I was sick of one thing, obviously, which is COVID. I was also very sick of writing about Donald Trump after Hiding in Plain Sight. And so I kind of thought, I'm going to write about him without writing about him and then try to encapsulate these broader themes because he's not new. As I said many times, he was a culmination, not an aberration, and he's going to have successors, and he had predecessors as well.
Do you think that the isolation that COVID-19 brought upon people made them more susceptible to conspiracy theories?
Yes, I mean, I think we are already heading in this direction. And I want to be clear that conspiracy theories, at least how I define it in They Knew, is a neutral term. If you have a conspiracy, if you have a plot by powerful actors in which there is corruption and there's no transparency, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you have some evidence, but you don't have all the evidence, you form a theory. You form a theory about a conspiracy. How that is formed, what facts uphold that thesis is, I think, what makes it, a good or a bad one, because obviously these can be weaponized as well. Unfortunately, we live in an era of bad faith actors, of propagandists, of liars, and that was already in play. What COVID did, I think, is lead to cruelty, to a lack of empathy and to profound dehumanization where people were watching each other mostly through screens, and they were very unlikely to be in a situation where they would encounter somebody different from themselves, and that leads to generalizations and stereotypes, and of course it's going on in an atmosphere of profound trauma and mourning as well. So to some extent, it's understandable, and then of course we have an election with a proto-dictator on top of that, a lot going on. So yeah, I mean, it definitely did.
Here's something that you wrote in the book that was interesting to me. When reporters ask Missourians why they will not take the vaccine, One of the most common answers is that they are not opposed to it on principle, but are waiting to see if it is safe. I know this feeling. I got vaccinated when I was deemed eligible, but I did not like it or fully trust it. I simply hated COVID more and chose the vaccine over COVID. It was a lot like voting in a presidential election. So why did you not like or fully trust the vaccine?
Well, because it was new, because it was unrolled under very chaotic political circumstances, because Fauci was involved and he was someone who initially kind of blew the response to AIDS, but mostly because of suspicion about big pharma and what the Sacklers did, the opioid epidemic. I'd had very bad experiences myself with the healthcare system, with the pharmaceutical system. So I went in with skepticism. I didn't feel like I was getting clear answers from the CDC, but like I wrote, I felt like obviously my biggest fear was getting COVID and spreading it to someone I love, spreading it to my elderly in-laws, for example, or God forbid, spreading it to my husband and children. So I did it, but I understood when folks were hesitant. I understood when people didn't want to get on board right away and wanted to kind of see how things played out.
Now, I have actually heard the same thing when I talk, especially with politicians in rural Missouri. I asked Senator Holly Rader, what are you hearing from people that don't want to take the vaccine? It's exactly what you said in the book. It's like, it's too new and they don't know what's going to happen to them, which I think is a totally understandable reaction to it. Where I think it goes off the deep end is when people are like, it warps your DNA, or it has microchips in them.
Makes you a Wi-Fi hotspot.
Or, if it's linked to some of the debunked theories that vaccines cause autism, that's where I think it takes a turn away from skepticism and into a completely different area. How do you go from point A, which is reasonable, to point B, which is more outlandish?
I mean, the sort of guiding principle I hope people take away from They Knew is that if you want people to stop believing in baseless conspiracy theories, for example, that vaccines cause autism or so forth, you need to be completely transparent about the crimes that have been committed by powerful actors. The opioid epidemic, for example, where people were told this is safe, this is not addictive, you will be okay. That was a lie. We've had many lies like that within the medical system, and very little humility, very little apology. And I think if people approach it in that way, other people who are skeptical might be inclined to trust them because they'll be like, okay, they admit their mistake, they've learned from their mistake, they want to do right by us now, maybe I'll give them a chance. I think that's the way to do it, instead of bullying or hectoring or saying, read the science. It's like, well, you read the science last time and look what happened.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Should we feel sympathy for the people that harbor the more outlandish beliefs, not just about COVID, but about QAnon or something like that?
I think it depends. It goes back to the cruelty question.
Yeah.
Are they doing it out of hate? Are they doing it out of bigotry? Are they leading movements that could spur physical violence or harassment of people, especially based on their race, on their gender, on their religion, and so forth? That's very dangerous. That turns into mass movements. It's also, it's just hateful behavior that shouldn't be encouraged. I think people who just have what might be described as outlandish beliefs, if you're believing in Bigfoot or UFOs. Honestly, I'm more immune for this. Jason and I are both big X-Files fans, so
yeah.
Somewhere we'll have a private...
We'll get to that, but I think
private conversation about our deep-seated belief
and I
go out squatching.
I think that gets to a good point. If you just believe the truth is out there, like we all do, I think that's harmless, but I think it's when it's harming other people.
Yes.
Like with the Pizzagate situation where somebody went into that restaurant and shot off a gun, or the aforementioned autism vaccine linked where you don't vaccinate your children and then they're susceptible to diseases, it's kind of hard for me to feel sympathetic toward them, even if they got there maybe by being deceived. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, yeah. I think it's just there's a moral line where it's wrong to hurt others, and obviously it's more wrong to hurt others intentionally, but when you're doing it unintentionally, but you find out that you have, I think then you need to change your behavior so you're not. I would think something like we're seeing a polio mini epidemic in New York, in part because of anti-vaxxers and stuff, and that's hurting people, who can't get the vaccine yet. It hurts vulnerable people. I think if you let that be your moral compass and try to figure it out from there, then that's a good guide.
Now, one of the key points that you hit in the book is that conspiracies have been baked into the American consciousness for centuries. We're obviously talking about COVID in the first part of this conversation, but this is not a new thing for America. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, and again, to differentiate from conspiracies and conspiracy theories, there is a conspiracy against Native Americans by white settlers. There was a conspiracy against Black people who were enslaved. And then there were conspiracy theories built around that, propaganda and myths and fake race science and all these things to try to justify the nature of the conspiracy itself, which often was shrouded in secrecy. The beginnings of the Civil War, the secession of southern states, those were conspiracies shrouded in secrecy. The business plot that tried to oust FDR, again, and then of course there's the more infamous ones of recent ages, all the assassinations of the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, and then in the book, I mostly focus on the 70s and after. You see Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11 and its aftermath. The whole horrific era in which Jason and I have raised. We've known only conspiracies, and again, we've known to some degree only obfuscation. And the successful points in American history are when there's clarity about all of these issues. That clarity is a form of power for the general public. And I think that's one of the reasons that, radical right-wing actors are so desperately trying to suppress facts in schools, trying to rewrite American history, trying to keep this information, from the public and put forth an illusion of how America's history has gone instead.
And maybe this doesn't go into the realm of conspiracy, but I remember when I was growing up that when we were taught about presidents, like Woodrow Wilson was always a top 5 president. And then you actually read about him, and he was a racist. He totally mismanaged the post-World War I situation. Oh, yeah, he let his wife illegally run the country, which is probably I don't want to say it's my favorite conspiracy, but I mean, last time I checked, his wife wasn't elected vice president. So that's just one example that's not even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's just in the presidential level. Do you think that I'm obviously fascinated by conspiracies around the presidency and people in power, but I think your book goes deeper than just, presidencies and stuff like that. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, it kind of goes into a lot of different directions. There's a chapter on Jeffrey Epstein, who I wrote about in Hiding in Plain Sight. And back then, I'd written that before he was arrested and committed suicide. I talk about the predecessor to that operation, or who I think is the predecessor, at least Craig Spence, who at least ran a very similar operation in the 1980s. And that's a story that was completely memory hold. I bring up a lot of these incidents, these sort of major stories in their time that have just sort of vanished from public consciousness. And one of the reasons they vanished is because the journalists who wrote about them kept getting murdered. There are a lot of murdered investigators throughout this book. So that's one facet, at least politically. But I also talk about, for example, climate change denial. That is a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory launched by Exxon and other fossil fuel corporations to profiteer. And people tend to not think of that exactly as a conspiracy theory. When they hear that phrase, they'll think of more, Alex Jones or QAnon or kind of, everyday folks making stuff up. But, corporate actors do this. It's propaganda. It's a weaponized conspiracy theory along the lines of what a lot of our politicians do. But I discussed that as well. And one of the reasons I think the general public for so long was reluctant to believe in climate change is because it's so horrifying. It's so innately terrifying. It's an existential threat, and folks don't like to be told that they're facing an existential threat, so they're susceptible to a kind of toxic optimism. And we see that now, of course, in our political life with the constant Mueller's going to save us, Garland's going to save us, the election's going to save us, about all of these political catastrophes, all of this lack of accountability. It's the same mindset. It's a form of normalcy bias, this view that if things are really so bad, if things are really breaking down in such a serious way, surely someone would intervene. That has not been the case.
Do you think it's a good thing for people to not instantly believe that people in positions of authority are giving them the whole truth?
Yes, I think it's our obligation as citizens to challenge authority and to challenge power, and especially when you're dealing with, wealthy actors who hold enormous sway or are not elected to investigate where exactly they get that money. Who are they funding? We of course live in Missouri. We live in the capital of dark money. We've seen this kind of infestation within our own politics, but people have gotten into this kind of stand culture around public servants. They forget that they're public servants. They build weird little cults around Biden or Trump or Fauci or Mueller
J.B.
or...
Pritzker.
Who?
Have you seen the J.B.
Pritzker.
J.B. Pritzker meme explosion? I think that's kind of meant to be a joke, but continue.
Yeah, the recorder of deeds. No, just kidding.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, we obviously have to make the recorder of deeds in St. Louis the king of America.
You need to meme him more. Recorder of deeds needs some memeing. Sorry, this is a little in-joke conversation.
We're getting down a recorder of deeds rabbit hole, but
yeah, the thing I'm getting at is that this is, I think, another tendency. It's sort of linked, to what I was talking about, this toxic optimism that people are looking for a savior figure because they don't want to actually address the fact that so many people simultaneously are letting us down. They want to believe that somebody is really on top of things, somebody is really kind of holding down the fort. I think there are people out there that are dedicated public servants doing a very good job. We often don't know their names. We obviously saw so many people rising to the occasion during the pandemic, putting their lives on the line. During the pandemic, we often don't know their names either. These sort of personality cults, though, that have risen around political officials or even FBI directors and medical officials, I think they're dangerous.
Well, that leads into another question and a poignant part of your book where your son witnesses the Capitol being attacked on January 6th. But you decide to tell him that, quote, everything would be okay in the end just to get through the day. But then you turn completely heel on the idea of hope, writing, quote, you cannot govern on hope, and you cannot be governed by hope. Why, Sarah Kendzior, are you so anti-hope?
I'm anti-hope. First of all, I just have to say, my son is in the audience. He saw right through this, and I was back into, heel mommy mode, as you might say.
Anytime I can use the term turning heel, you're from Connecticut, right? From WWE is from there. I'm definitely going to use that term.
Yeah. So anyway, in terms of hope, I think it depends on how you define it. And a lot of people use the term hope to mean more a fantasy or a wish. Like if you just wish for it hard enough, it will come true. Or that, the arc of humanity naturally bends towards justice, where in reality that arc needs to be bent and pushed. I believe in perseverance. I believe in resilience. I believe in compassion. I believe in action. I don't think just sort of wishing something will make it so. And I definitely don't think that pointing out the myriad of ways that things have gone wrong is a bad thing. I think it's an absolutely necessary thing. You need to point out all the ways people are screwing up, especially when we pay for them with our tax money, so that they will improve. It's a civic obligation. I don't believe in hopelessness either. I guess I'll just put it that way. I don't believe in hope. I don't believe in hopelessness. I believe in having a moral code and in committing yourself to action for the benefit of the public.
So you spend a lot of time in your book talking about QAnon. What do you think the rise in popularity of that online phenomenon says about people's willingness to believe in conspiracies?
Yeah, probably the most controversial thing I'll say that I say in They Knew is gotta hand it to QAnon on that Epstein thing. The reason that a lot of folks were drawn to QAnon is because they had a large grain of truth within this morass of, propaganda or lies or just sort of wild theories, like JFK Jr. had risen from the dead to be Trump's vice president.
Yeah, JFK Jr. is alive, everybody. Just want to let you know.
As they were saying all of these, sort of ridiculous things or sometimes harmful things, they also were doing serious, rigorous investigative work into the Epstein-Maxwell operation and to other real conspiracies, ones that our mainstream media just didn't want to touch, and still, generally speaking, does not want to touch. And because QAnon was more accurate on those topics than I would say most of the media, and certainly our political officials were, they therefore were given an element of legitimacy by people kind of watching what was going on. They gained acolytes. And that was very valuable for political propagandists, for the Republican Party, for anybody who wanted to weaponize this group. I see a very kind of diverse coalition in there. Some people are genuinely trying to find out what is going on in this country and why it is so corrupt, and they're being led down a very, very dark path. They've been manipulated. It doesn't mean everything they're believing is entirely wrong, and that's actually the danger. Because if something is completely outlandish, if it's completely absurd, it's easier for folks to understand that and to dismiss it. When there's elements of truth within that, it becomes harder. And so that's one way of covering it up. The flip side of that, of course, is that when I come along, writing, hiding in plain sight with the big, Jeffrey Epstein, espionage, mafia, all this kind of stuff, people are like, oh, you sound like those QAnon folks. You're a real tinfoil hat kind of gal. I got a lot of that. That was one of the reasons I wrote They Knew, is because I wanted to explain, why that reaction happens and kind of destigmatize the term of conspiracy theorist. It's like, do I have a theory about a conspiracy? Why, yes, I do. Why is it only a theory? Because the government or other official actors are covering things up. They're not having hearings. They're not issuing reports. They're not doing investigations. They're not indicting. They're not being transparent. Therefore, sadly, all I am left with is a theory. But I think that is a positive thing for our civic well-being. It could go in a lot of bad directions. On principle, it is a positive thing to do research, to investigate, to be critical, to think critically about your government. But you also have to think carefully. And I think that's kind of where some folks go awry.
Yeah, you talk about the idea of wrapping a kernel of truth into, I would guess, this example I give is not absurdity, but into kind of a false rationalization. And having watched the Ukraine-Russian war quite a bit, and being half Ukrainian and being descendant of Ukrainian Jews, it is absolutely true that there was anti-Semitism among Ukrainian nationalism, especially in the 1920s. I know this because I read accounts of my own family talking about how Ukrainian nationalists rounded up Jews in their village and killed them all. But I don't think that justifies Russia engaging in a genocidal imperialistic war of conquest, when the reality is, Russia doesn't want Ukraine to exist. This is not my opinion. If you actually read history about what's going on between those two countries historically, that's what's there, but they're kind of using this truth that there is anti-Semitism in Ukraine to justify that. Can you talk on that?
Yeah, that's one of many conspiracy theories that they've launched about Ukrainians. They're just flat out lies. It's too flattering to almost deem it a theory. They're liars, they're propagandists. They're trying to get Russians to not see Ukrainians as human beings, and one of the way they do that is to make claims that Ukrainians, don't see Jewish people as human beings, or that they're fascists, or that they're neo-Nazis. Part of that is to tap into, Russia's glory days in World War II, actually fighting against the Nazis and capitalize on that mythology, and that's what Putin has always done. But the goal, Putin's goal is an imperialist goal. It's to bring back the Soviet Union, and especially starting with Ukraine, which is a very large country, resource-rich country, and Western-facing country that was trying to overcome a legacy of corruption, and that was extremely threatening to them. I think it's important to emphasize Russia did not just invade Ukraine this year. It invaded in 2014, and it captured Crimea illegally. So, this is an 8-year war. We were at, kind of the culmination of a conflict to the point where we start talking about whether nuclear weapons will be used, and that's how it attracted international attention. But, Ukrainians have been fighting this battle a very long time.
And, I've read reports that there's this constant stream of official governmental propaganda in Russia that is demonizing Ukrainian government and Ukrainians in general. I saw a video once of somebody who did a random chat roulette, and they had a Ukrainian flag, and they talked with a bunch of Russians, and then just horrible epithets were flown at them, which signals to me I'm sure there are ordinary Russians that are resisting this, maybe quietly, but there are a lot who have just bought into this. How does this affect the ability for like this war to lose popular support in Russia? Because that's a real tall barrier to go over.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been watching, and to be clear, I have a PhD from WashU, and what I studied at WashU was authoritarianism in the former Soviet Union and how it's expressed through digital media. And I was doing this from 2006 to 2012, so it's a very different digital landscape. But Russia was a very interesting country then, because what they would do is not censor everything like Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or other more totalitarian regimes were doing. They would leave the internet open just enough to let wild rumors, conspiracy theories, propaganda, just sort of overwhelm the population so that they would not even want to try to figure out truth. And of course, Russia is a deeply corrupt country. It was deeply corrupt then, and that was the kind of thing that the government did not want its citizens investigating. And I look at what happened to Russia, where you see people who are independent thinkers fleeing the country or being jailed or being beaten. And I worry for our country because I've seen that, de-evolution, and it wasn't in a good place to begin with, but it's in a worse place now. And notably, Russia is cutting off the internet because they don't want, the Kremlin does not want Russian citizens to see that they are massively losing this war against Ukraine. And so, there is an effort at information control. That kind of fire hose of propaganda, can only carry you so far.
We'll be right back with more of my conversation with Sarah Kendzior right after this break. And now, here's more of my conversation with Sarah Kendzior, the author of the new book, They Knew, How a Culture of Conspiracy Kept America Complacent. So let's shift from Russia to Missouri.
Yes.
How's that for a transition? You talk a lot about how pundits, specifically ones who are from the East Coast, are derisively tagging places like Missouri as deep red states that deserve the policies that are implemented. And you're not a fan of that idea.
No.
Can you explain why you're not a fan of that idea?
We don't deserve this. We also did not vote for this. And by we, I really mean the majority of Missourians. I think, folks in the room will remember the 2018 ballot initiatives. They'll remember Clean Missouri, the efforts to get rid of dark money, raise the minimum wage, protect, labor unions. I think our state is hard to define politically. I think it really, encompasses the entire political spectrum. And if we're held together by anything, it's with profound disillusionment and frustration with our elected officials. I do obviously think we've become as a state more right-wing in the last 15 or so years, in large part from the influence of Fox News, the demise of local media, the demise of trust, and sort of just the downward trajectory of the country as a whole, in which we're kind of, once again, the bellwether state. We're kind of the originator of a lot of these dark trends. They hit here first. But yeah, I'm really, really sick of hearing from people on social media, sometimes right to my face, that I deserve to get Delta COVID, which, originated here, because of course I said, we're the bellwether state. I deserve to have Eric Schmidt sign away my bodily autonomy, one morning. Like I deserve to suffer, and everyone else deserves to suffer, and it doesn't matter who we are, or what we believe, or if we have children, or if we have loved ones, we all somehow deserve to suffer. It's an illusion. There's no such thing as a red state or a blue state. As I've said many times, I said in my first book, View from Flyover Country, America is purple. It's purple like a bruise. We are held together in collective pain, but also no state is like this. There's no such thing as a blue state either. California has the largest number of Republican voters in the country. Every place is more complex and nuanced than it's made out to be. And I wish folks could see that, because one thing I'm worried about, and I write about this and They Knew, are these secessionist movements, popping up in places like Texas or California. Because I don't know, maybe to some folks it's an abstraction. It's like a fun idea they play with in their mind, like we'll have a red paradise or a blue paradise. When you live here, when you live in the center of the country, when you live in a place that historically was the dividing line between a free state and a slave state, and a source of so much conflict and so much pain, it is terrifying. I don't know what would happen if there's this kind of modern civil war that would break out. It would not be like the 19th century Civil War. It would not be some North versus South thing. It would be, I think, the goal is to try to strip the country down, sell it off for parts, and create various oligarch fiefdoms, none of which will be a paradise of any sort. And that is why I think it's extremely important that all Americans understand this and that we stick together as a country and we, fight corruption and we find transparency and we figure out some way to live with each other, because what they want to do in splitting us all apart, it's to no one's benefit but the plutocrats and the oligarchs and the dictators and the demagogues and the liars and the thieves.
Now, I pulled out my wallet. Oh. Now, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your adulation, Sarah. I pulled out my wallet just as a transparency disclosure thing. I am a member of SEIU Local 1 because whenever I teach at Washington University, I pay dues to them. So whenever I talk about unions, I want to make clear that I am, when I am teaching, a member of a union. I'm not teaching now, so I technically am not part of them. So, I've heard anecdotes in 2016 that 30 or 40% of labor union members voted for Trump in Missouri and voted for Eric Greitens, who said he was going to implement right to work. And this was from labor leaders. This wasn't just from the ether. So does that kind of prove your point that Missourians are complex and they sometimes vote in ways that are not just red-blue archetypes?
Yeah, what we've seen continually is people will vote for policies that tend to be fairly progressive, that benefit the public good, and then they vote for candidates that destroy all those policies. They vote for Republican candidates, like Greitens or Hawley or others. I think a lot of that, again, has to do with a propaganda influx. I think that a lot of people are genuinely deceived. When I've talked to folks, from more conservative regions of Missouri, or when I've interviewed people running for Congress or so forth in other regions, they think people really believe this. I know I met many people in Missouri when Trump was running in 2016 who genuinely believed that he was this incredibly successful businessman, this outsider renegade, and he would, bring back jobs here. He understood the feeling of abandonment people had felt. I also have to add that another appeal of Trump and Greitens for many of these individuals is that these are racist people. These are people who want a white supremacist candidate, either overt or more covert. They were very put off by Obama. They saw that as, this grievous injustice. There's a lot of really vindictive and rotten stuff lurking there too. But then there's other people who that really wasn't the issue. It really was economic. It is a mixed bag. It is a complicated situation.
What does it mean to be a writer from Missouri?
Ask Mark Twain. I don't know. That's the thing. A lot of folks sometimes are surprised that I live here and surprised that I live here voluntarily because I write about politics on a national level, and there's this pressure on writers to move to New York or DC or LA or whatever, some big city on the coast, because then you've made it, you matter. And this has been historically the place where the national character is born, not just in politics through being the bellwether state, but look at our great pop culture influences. Look at Mark Twain or Walt Disney or Chuck Berry, these incredibly seminal figures who invent whole genres. They came out of Missouri. This is kind of where the idea of America was born. So I think it's just, historically, it's a fascinating place to live. It's also my home. It's where my kids are born. It's their hometown. And, when you become a parent, you see everything through the eyes of your children. And, I considered myself a mother before I considered myself anything, even more than a writer. It's impossible for me to separate those things. But yeah, I'm going to continue, writing about Missouri and writing about America from a Missouri perspective. And, I don't apologize. And if folks living elsewhere don't like it, that's too bad.
One of the things I've always enjoyed about your writing is how you've positioned Sarah Kendzior, the character, in a lot of your work. It was obviously in your first book, since it was a collection of essays, and also in Hiding in Plain Sight, and also this. And it included, for example, the beginning of the book where you travel to Eureka Springs, but there's other examples, where you're swimming and you see the sky start to turn, I guess, pink because there's wildfires. By the way, I was just in Oregon and I saw exactly that. So after reading that. It does actually happen. I'm interested of like why you've decided to use this literary device, because I think there's often a pull with writers about whether they should insert themselves into their writing, but I think you do it to like make broader points about what you're doing.
Yeah, it wasn't a plan. It wasn't something I set out to do. You know, I spent time in academia where you don't use the first person. You don't insert yourself in your work unless you're showing how subjective you are and that you are part of the story. You know, in anthropology especially, it's important to be clear about that. The thing is I started writing about so many things that people did not want to believe were happening. You know, Trump's connection to organized crime and the Kremlin, the Jeffrey Epstein story, you know, the effect of income inequality or rotting institutions on the American public. A lot of people thought I might be hyperbolic. They thought I might be alarmist. They thought I might be insane. You know, so I thought, you know, if I'm going to get people to trust me, and I do want them to trust me while they're reading me, I need to be honest about who I am and what are my biases and what are my beliefs and what is my background and, you know, where am I getting this perspective? And then I kind of just fell into a pattern of writing in the first person, you know, especially writing about travels around the country and things like that. And again, you know, Mark Twain is he is an influence on me there because that is something he did, kind of combining, you know, travelogue and politics and, you know, personal experience. But it's mostly because we live in such a convoluted time, and we have a lot of reporters and writers who try to put on this veneer of objectivity. You know, like, I'm just an impartial person. I'm removed from this whole COVID situation and removed from this whole political situation. Like, no one is at this point. I mean, I think it's dishonest, and I certainly understand if you're a reporter, you're writing a feature article, you should leave yourself out of it. But when folks try to act, you know, when they're expressing an opinion, like it's just sort of divinely coming from above in some way that, you know, their own personal input bears no, it doesn't affect at all the conclusions that they're coming to. I mean, I think that's delusional. So I at least want to be upfront, you know, about where I'm coming from.
Now, you mentioned the news media, and I do have to ask about something else you write in your book. Your disdain for paywalls, which you described as blocking content from general view. And you actually compare journalism to becoming more like academia in that information is prohibitively expensive. Now, I work for St. Louis Public Radio. We don't have a paywall, but I've also worked for newspapers that cease to exist because news consumers don't want to pay for content. So how do you balance the desire to pay journalists like an equitable wage by making sure that there's a revenue stream, but also making sure that important information is available for public view?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm concerned about paywalls is because, you know, one of the reasons I was able to figure out all the things I did about Trump or other American political figures is because the information was in the public domain, you know, meaning that I could go into the archives of different newspapers or magazines or what have you and get it quickly and get it easily. On the other hand, you know, I've worked as a journalist. I've worked as a freelance journalist, being either paid terrible wages or being offered quote unquote exposure as my payment, you know, which I would turn down. So I absolutely think journalists should be paid. What I'm seeing sometimes are giant corporations, like the ones that own the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're erecting paywalls and they're charging very large subscription fees that I don't think they need to charge to turn profitable. You know, they can do that easily. My sympathies are with the local papers. They're with the smaller places, the investigative outlets, you know, those that don't have funding. And I'm kind of in disbelief that no one has made up a system kind of akin to like how iTunes would work, where you could buy singles.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that. And actually, not to go down that analogy more, but like I recently subscribed to Apple Music, where for $9.99 you can like download whatever song you want. Like, I was thinking I wanted to listen to Coolio's Gangster's Paradise, and I just did that. It's an okay song. But like, maybe we could do that same thing for journalists and maybe just split the profits like 3,000 ways or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, they stumble on an article, they're really excited to read it, they want to know what's next, then boom, paywall. And they're not going to go through the effort of like subscribing to some random newspaper in a town they've never heard of and paying like $60 a year. But will they pay $1 probably, especially if it's something really easy, like especially if there's some sort of all-purpose pass and you just hit yes, yes. I mean, what will happen, of course, is you'll end up racking up some article fees on your credit card, but people would eventually adjust, and I think it would be positive. I think it would be revenue generating.
You should still support your local media outlets,
Yes.
whether it be newspaper or NPR. Now, before we turn it to questions, and NPR affiliates too, like the mothership doesn't really need your money. Actually, it probably does. Before we turn it over to questions, let's talk a little bit about X-Files.
Yes.
Because that seemed to be your pandemic show of choice. I think mine ended up being like Gossip Girl, where I found out that the main character Dan was upset his book was only on the New York Times bestseller for 1 week. I told Sarah backstage I would probably kill a yak to be a New York Times bestseller. I'm pretty we'll keep my fingers crossed about this one. But why X-Files?
Oh, I've been a fan of X-Files since I was in high school, since it debuted. I got very into it. Sadly, X-Files was where I learned about a lot of episodes of U.S. history and world history that were real. Operation Paperclip, Area 51, things that actually existed. This is, of course, not quite before the internet, but when the internet was more of a burgeoning phenomenon. And, the X-Files online community was a place where you could go and have conversation with other nerds about all of these interesting topics. So, I learned a great deal from the X-Files, so much so that it kind of, I think I absorbed it, as a teenager and a college student in a way that I didn't recognize. I'm fairly sure I've recited lines that were actually Agent Mulder's on national television. Like, I'm pretty sure I've said, no institution has jurisdiction over the truth, or something akin to that. And then during the pandemic, my family and I, they're here, I made them watch X-Files with me. I was like, come on, kids, civics class. And we would all go into the living room and watch it together. And I was like, oh no, like I thought I invented this quote, but it wasn't. I picked this up when I was like 14 or 15 from Mulder. Anyway, very good show. Seasons 2 through 5 are the best. I don't know what your opinion is on this.
I remember watching that because it might have been on the same, was it on the same, it was on the same night as The Simpsons, was it?
It eventually moved to Sundays. It started on Fridays.
So, fun fact, you mentioned online weirdos. When I was like 11, 12 years old, I used to lurk in like the Simpsons internet world, especially Simpsons fan fiction. And there's some like...
You're revealing a lot about yourself tonight, Jason.
I wrote some really horrible Simpsons fan fiction as a 13-year-old. I played the game Final Fantasy VII as a kid, so I basically like had this Bart travel back in time a bunch, and he had to defeat like this character that was like Sephiroth or something like that. I'm glad that it's on a computer that is now in a dumpster. On that note, I would like to turn it over back to Shane or somebody so that you can ask Sarah some questions.
Thank you. I'm really curious. I have kids that are in their early 20s, and I get the impression that they are just very untrusting of institutions and politicians, and I see some real good in that. They can go a little far, but I think I'd be really curious what you think is coming for the next generation on all these issues.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's something I think about with my own kids. There's a lot of things I'm worried about, but I think the thing that's going to affect everything is climate change. It's going to affect our economy. It's going to affect, any kind of jobs or education that we have. We just saw the effects of it here in St. Louis with the floods. As painful as it is, I do encourage people to just think about that when they're trying to imagine the future. Not imagine no future, not imagine just sheer apocalypse, but try to be realistic and think, what are ways around that. When you're dwelling too much on that, then I do encourage people to live for the day and develop appreciation for what we do have, and also, learn history, learn as much as you can while we can. The reason I fight hard for things, or I document things that are unpleasant, is because I want to keep the pleasant things. And so, as a parent, I try to balance that out, to show my kids things that are good or interesting or engaging, to balance out that darkness, because I do think we're going, to a dark place, and I don't mean to depress you. I mean, obviously, I probably depressed you already, but I feel like we have to be honest, and I think the younger generation really, they get that, they sense that, they can see through all the BS. I think in a way, a lot of older generations, including mine, they just didn't want to. They're realistic in a way that does make me. I wouldn't say optimistic, but it's an encouraging development, I think, the kind of resolute, realistic attitude of young people.
This question is actually from me. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
So I'm secretly on Twitter and refused for so many years to get on Twitter, but I signed up to follow people like you and to stay politically active and involved, and also follow some of the favorite authors that are coming through town. But as some news sources are becoming more fair and balanced, and the internet becomes deeper and deeper into a hole, how do you balance between those dark abyss places and making fun and light of enjoying the social part of social media?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a weird position because I'm, I guess, a public figure, and I have like 600,000 followers, and a lot of them, including people who are not following me, sort of welcome me every day with a new bout of invective and accusations. So that can be difficult. It initially kind of shocked me when I started out in journalism how vicious it could be, and I know a lot of people have had this experience, especially people who aren't white, and especially women. But I know who my friends are, I guess, online, and I also think it really is a miraculous thing. As much as I kind of detest the internet a lot, and especially the architecture of social media sites, these algorithms that drive us to places, I love that we can get so much information. I did fantasize about this when I was a kid, and in the 90s, it was so thrilling to be able to get online and look up all these things. And I look at the stuff my kids are able to do, when they could just like go on Google Translate and read an article in a foreign language. We've come to take a lot of things, a lot of developments the last 10 years for granted, this incredible amount of knowledge, this incredible ability to communicate, because it's been used for evil. So many people have used it for evil, but it's still, to go back in time, to go back 20 years, we would be in a darker place, I think, in terms of what we know. And, there has been somewhat of an equalizing effect. I owe my career to the internet. My first book, was a collection of essays that I initially just published myself because, I'm a Missouri writer, so of course I can't be, worth anything. And then suddenly when Hillary Clinton started quoting it and all these other famous people started quoting it, the publishing houses came calling and they wanted to, do a print edition, and it became a bestseller. That was due to the fact that I found my readers on the internet, that they found me and we connected, and I don't think that would have been possible without it. So I do owe a lot to Twitter and to just being online in general.
You had mentioned Mark Twain earlier. I think one time when he bankrupted himself, he committed to paying everybody back, and so he made a tour and presented lectures. What we're doing here tonight is sort of like this late 19th century mode of communication and public discourse, where people are in front of us, we listen to them, and I get to ask a question. You wrote these books. These are long forms of communication. As an ex-academic, I'm very disturbed that it seems like modern civilization is moving away from longer forms of discourse to forms of discourse such as Facebook or Twitter that are extremely brief, that do not allow for a give and take that older, longer forms of either written or verbal discourse permitted. The question is, does that structurally, that technology structurally, make us as a society more susceptible to autocracy? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question, and I do think it does. I think the structure of social media, the character limitations, the ability of people to use screenshots to decontextualize the original text and have it travel all over the internet away, from its home base. A page of a book, a line, from a paragraph, a word in a sentence. That's the kind of thing people are reading. They get it through memes, which can spread disinformation incredibly rapidly. I felt like we had a nice equilibrium going in kind of the 2000s in the blogging era, where people wrote long, analyses with the links inside, so you could see, what is the source for this? Where are they getting this information? And then they would comment, and yes, the comments could be very obnoxious, but there was usually some sort of thought process behind it, and bad actors were often castigated for their behavior. If somebody was lying, if somebody was attacking, they sometimes would be kind of, pushed out of the group, barred from the forum or something. There's nothing like that now. And I do think, there's some value in brevity. You can see a lot of aphorisms, a lot of fun phrases and expressions, but I do think the damage of losing long-form writing is grave, and I think that the paywalls have made this worse, because as the really good investigative reporting or rigorous analytical pieces hide behind the paywalls, what's free? Disinformation, memes, little one-liners, cheap little tricks. That's the kind of thing that everybody has access to. And I do think it's bad for our critical thinking, and I think it's bad for the truth.
Question from the virtual audience. From one Sarah to another, hypothetically, if we were not living in the kind of society and world we are now, what would you be doing instead?
Oh gosh, it depends how much money I have. If we didn't have COVID, I'd be traveling more. If I didn't feel, and I really hope this doesn't sound self-righteous or something, but I do have expertise in autocracies. I did spend most of my career studying them. I do have a good track record of predictions. So I feel obligated to write about the political landscape of America because I care about it and because I'm worried about my children's future and I want to document it and change that future and make things better. I wish things weren't the way they are. It's hard for me. It's hard for me psychologically. I think it's hard for everybody in this room to contend with all of these crises intersecting at once. And there are times where I look back and I think about, simpler eras, and, I was happier then, not 100%. Some of this is just me. But yeah, I think I would travel. I would maybe, write fiction instead, or just write about other things, write about things beyond corruption and fascism and catastrophe and, apocalyptic developments. But, that's not how things have worked out, and I don't want to back away from the fight. I'm not a great organizer. I'm not a great activist. I don't want to run for office, but I think I'm a pretty good writer, and so I feel that's my obligation. That's what I should be doing now, hopefully to benefit folks, at least make them feel less alone, and at best to bring information, that illuminates what's going on.
I'm a current academic, so I have to do the horrible, more of a comment than a question, but it follows on really nice with what you just said, because in the beginning of your book, your previous book, Hiding in Plain Sight, I recalled very vividly you talking about making a note about what you believe in, because it can change. And I want to say that I've been thinking about that a lot. I work at WashU, I was a staff scientist there, and with human subjects research, and with Dobbs, I have spent a lot of time actually trying to get guarantees about our participants' privacy. And I actually got it Friday. It's not as shared in the public as it is now, but I can say that I actually wrote down some of the things about human subjects' privacy and what the ethics of research are, and referred to it quite a bit over the last few months as I've been emailing and working to get the info. So it has made a difference. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you for sharing.
Got time for a couple more questions.
I worked in media for many years, And it's been my experience that a lot of the negative things that go on, people have so much apathy, they want somebody else to fight their battles for them. I want to know, how do you address apathy, especially in this day and age when there's so much confusion, and where do I start?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time what we're seeing now isn't exactly apathy, it's exhaustion, it's being overwhelmed on all sides, it's a struggle to just get through the day, particularly with an ongoing pandemic. I've met very few people who are apathetic in the way I remember people being apathetic, say, in the 90s. And granted, I was a teenager, so we were all very apathetic and cool and whatever, never mind. But, what I see now is honestly the opposite. People having very strong opinions, sometimes based on absolutely nothing, or based on rumors, based on lies, that kind of thing. Or people, just burning themselves out, trying to analyze our political environment, trying to figure out what's going on, and then just saying, you know what? I can't do it. I'm checking out of the situation. It's too disturbing. It's too overwhelming. No one is being forthright. And this is actually what happened, in authoritarian states. This is how democracies die, is through people checking out in that way. At the same time, I think we need to be understanding, particularly, with the pandemic. Like I could deal with the attempted coup, the rising fascism, the environmental collapse, the declining economy, the systemic racism, the misogyny. When they added in the pandemic, I was like, this is too much. Like even I hit that wall, as I said in the beginning of the talk. It's difficult for me to even start writing, and I've been writing my entire life. Since I was 3 years old, I would make up stories. I would make up little newspaper reports for my neighborhood, that kind of thing. So it's tough. I'm not so much worried about people becoming apathetic as I am that they become conformist, I guess, in their thinking, that they get led down cults or wormholes, or they lose their propensity for critical thinking. That's what I'm most worried about.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about Orban being brought to Texas.
Yes, so Viktor Orban is the dictator of Hungary. That's a sad sentence for me to say, because Hungary historically has struggled under so many dictatorships. We know when it was a Warsaw Pact country, when it was oppressed by the Soviet Union and by its little proxy actors that were running it. I went to Hungary for the first time in 1998, and people were so excited. They were so happy to finally have a taste of freedom, a taste of autonomy and sovereignty. And then Orban came in almost a decade ago at this point, and has a hyper-nationalist, semi-autocratic, but really veering much more towards fully autocratic rule. And that's a shocking thing to have in an EU country. It's a shocking thing for Europe. We've seen similar developments in Poland, in Turkey, and other countries that I've enjoyed visiting and that were democracies, much more so just a few years before. The significance of Orban coming to America, I think, is deep, because what we're dealing with is transnational alliances, an axis of autocrats. And we see these in, well-known authoritarian states like Russia, partnering up with oligarchs and mafiosos and bad actors and so forth. In the West, we could look at Brexit, UK, and of course we can look at our own country. They don't care whether any of these countries really survive. Whatever kind of nationalism they're putting out there, whatever make America great or make Hungary great or whatever, a lot of it is facile. It capitalizes on xenophobia or racism or whatnot, but a lot of it is about profiteering. It's about making money off of the wreckage and also exerting great control in a time of climate catastrophe. If these individuals are able to align, these oligarchs and plutocrats and dictators around the world who hold such disproportionate wealth and power, then it's easier for them to hoard, what we will need to survive the future. That's why I feel like there should be a very sharp eye on all of them, and I wish our politicians would speak more openly about this, because I just think, well, what would I do if I were them? What would I do if I were the bad guy? And I can come up with, a zillion ideas, and then to my great horror, I watch them carry them out, and I'm like, oh, come on. If I could figure this out from a laptop in St. Louis, then surely you, with your classified intelligence in Washington, D.C., should have some idea of what's going on and maybe a plan to stop it. That hasn't been the case.
Go to one final question.
Yeah, Thanks for being here. You kind of answered some of this, but just look at 9/11, very strange thing happens, and then Project for a New American Century, you've got like the dream policies of both certain American elites and Israeli government elites. You've got these policies happen. You've got the Epstein, this bizarre island that you have the former president and then the person who won the popular vote, the husband of the person who won the popular vote in 2016, and then also the person became president, all coming to the strange island, and then he dies. And it had been, the strange stuff, and then 9/11, of course, was it a lab leak? Was it someone eat the wrong bet? So all these things, of course it's making us all insane. Like, what is real? What is not real? What are the conspiracies? And sort of I want to read some of the stuff you've written before, but the average person's not going to be able to sit down all day and try to figure exactly what happened. And it's logical people are going to go into QAnon, especially talking about Epstein, but what is the proper balance for someone who's realize there's all this stuff up and I'm not going to get to the bottom of it, but I need to fight for what's right? Because these conspiracies exist, but it seems like the conspiracies are used by a lot of the people involved in the conspiracies to sell misleading conspiracies to be able to carry out the original conspiracy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and is actually one of the things I write about most in the book is exactly that formulation. And I write about 9/11, and here's the part where the headline's going to be Kendzior raises questions about 9/11. I do have questions about 9/11. I do, and I'm not the only one. I have questions about, Saudi involvement. I have questions about why Netanyahu and Sharon were so excited. I have questions about the, right-wing neocons who did have, a plan for war well before 9/11. I have questions about why people like Giuliani or Bernard Kerik were central figures in 9/11 and the Iraq War, and then went on to be central figures in the attempt to overthrow the American government while being aligned with various oligarchs and mafiosos from abroad, who they were also aligned with back in the 90s and 2000s, and who were also aligned with Jeffrey Epstein. This discussion, these questions merit discussion, and they're very disturbing. It's not just me asking them. I bring up some senators, reputable people who aren't sort of full of, they've done their research. They were on the 9/11 Commission and felt it did not satisfactorily answer their questions. So that whole stigma, that whole thing that was thrown at us in the years after 9/11, that to dare question the official narrative of 9/11 was to be crazy, unpatriotic, anti-American. It's been over 20 years, and I think it's fine to reassess this. There are crazy theories. There are theories like the planes never existed, they were CGI. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about who benefited from this. How did our intelligence fail so enormously? What did they lie about after? Were the people who did fail us, were they outed as such, or are they still working in the halls of our bureaucracies and still not being able to catch espionage agents or people like Epstein that are running around, as I said in my previous book, hiding in plain sight? We obviously have some serious failures from above and a lot of complicity. So yeah, I welcome those questions when they're in good faith, and I think a lot of us are capable of having these conversations, these nuanced, evidence-based conversations in good faith that do challenge the official narrative of various events.
You can learn more about Sarah Kendzior's They Knew, How a Culture of Conspiracy Kept America Complacent by going to STLPR.org or left/bank.com. Many thanks to Left Bank Books and the Ethical Society for making this event happen. I'm Jason Rosenbaum, and thank you for listening.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.